and welcome everybody tonight for these readings. So the authors who are reading tonight are recognized by the Connecticut Center for the Book as either finalists or winners of the 2021 Connecticut Book Awards. Our partner, the Connecticut Literary Festival, under the direction of Jotham Borello, is producing the Connecticut Book Awards reading tour into the spring of 2022. And that is curated by Anna Cristiano. Make sure to check the festival website for upcoming readings and the 2022 Lit Talk series. The website address is connecticutliteraryfestival.org. We have three authors with us tonight: Sari Rosenblatt, Kerri Arsenault, and Benjamin S. Grossberg. While each of our authors are reading, please consider any questions you'd like to ask and add them to the chat box during the Q&A, and we'll pick them up during the Q&A later in the evening. Sari Rosenblatt will start us off. She's going to start off with a reading from Father Guards the Sheep, a collection of short stories and a Connecticut Book Awards fiction finalist. Sari has published stories in the Iowa Review, among other publications. She holds an MFA from the Iowa Writers Workshop and teaches fiction writing at the Educational Center for the Arts in New Haven. So welcome, Sari.
Lisa, thank you so much. And thank you, RJ Julia, Connecticut Center for the Book, Connecticut Literary Festival. So many people are involved in this happening, and I'm very appreciative. So Father Guards the Sheep, not everyone is a short story reader. But I love the short story form. I've been writing these stories for probably 25, 30 years. And I just finished up a novel also based on one of these stories. This book is a long time coming, and I'm very grateful to the Iowa Book Award for honoring me with that award for these stories. All I can say, it took a long time for this collection to be born. I'm going to read little excerpts from two stories. There's 8 stories altogether in this collection. And I chose these selections because I thought they might tie in with what Kerri is going to be reading in her book, Milltown. Because my background, which finds its way into my fiction, is having grown up in Naugatuck, Connecticut, very much a factory town, a mill town. One of the main streets in town is the Millville Avenue, and the other main street is Rubber Avenue, because this was like the footwear capital of the world. Naugatuck, Connecticut, which made Kids. You all know Kids. Naugahyde is, if anyone is sat on a couch with faux leather material, that's Naugahyde. And I grew up in my father's store. My father had a clothing store in Naugatuck, which served predominantly workers at the rubber factory. And I always wanted to just get that down and memorialize that. So I'm going to start reading an excerpt of the first story in the collection called Daughter of Retail. And the first story and the last story are kind of bookends. In this story, I'm going to read the narrator is 12. And in the last story, she's in her 30s. Okay, Daughter of Retail, first story in my collection. Retail works like this. Someone walks in the door and she's yours. You may not fall in love, but you have to put her body before yours. You must see whatever it is she wants to show you, smell her smell, satisfy her. You must sell yourself before you sell the suit. I was 12 when I started working in my father's store. Schmers. Say what you need, get what you want, we got the whole schmer. Shorten the slogan, for Christ's sake, complained the 80-year-old accountant. Shorten your mouth and maybe you'll learn to add, said my father. circling a number a half-mile down from the top of his ledger. They sat in Schmer's glass-encased office, which gave my father a commanding view of who was selling or talking or stealing. The accountant's white hair had one large bald spot, a pink planet of a spot whose topography was speckled with mauve and brown gases. My father banged his index finger into his ledger as though hammering a nail into oak. "To the moon, Alice," my father yelled at the little old man, betraying his equal disdain for women and math morons. In his own bald head, my father could figure columns of numbers the length of Rubber Avenue. Though he was a merchant of wearable goods, anything that could be hung on a rack or stacked on a shelf, what he loved most was numbers. He'd sell numbers if he could, but he couldn't. Schmer's New York bargain goods was his inheritance, his own father's most successful enterprise, after the Naugatuck Screw Factory went belly up, and it was his duty as oldest son to take it over. Numbers would have to wait, or he would have to do them on the side. Just as a fine artist must sometimes steal time to do his art, my father had to steal time to figure his columns of numbers. You could say he stole time from his children, but he wouldn't have known what to do with us anyway. That's just beginning of Daughter of Retail. My family did have a clothing store in Naugatuck, Connecticut, Rosenblatt's, which just in the last 2 months has closed for good. Another story. But I'm going to read the last story, just not the whole story, just a little excerpt from the last story in the story collection called As in Life. And whereas the first story probably took place in 1965, this story now takes place in 1995, 30 years later, and the father has aged. When I walk through the door of Schmer's, the lights are dim and flat, and hanging from brown racks, the women's sweatshirts look exhausted. Outside, it's raining hard, and I set my wet umbrella in the dark alcove near the front door. On one side of the alcove, bordering the stairs to the second floor, baby clothes hang from a high pole. Occasionally, like now toward Christmas, a customer might buy an infant gown or one-piece romper, but otherwise, the baby clothes live here, like curled up bats, sleeping. On the first floor of Schmer's, lots of clothes sleep. Khaki slacks with elastic waists, embroidered cardigans, robe and nightie sets. Stuart, my brother's real bread and butter, comes from Catholic school uniforms on the second floor. But the first floor lives on 2 long aisles like 2 underground tunnels for parents who, in the course of buying clothes for their children, have an arresting impulse to buy for themselves something they didn't know they needed. Schmer's used to sell it all and sell it like crazy. And our slogan for the past 7 decades was, this, that, the whole Schmer. This was when the U.S. Rubber Company, Naugatuck Footwear Division, was our neighbor across the street. Before U.S. Rubber closed shop, the rubber workers would rush in on their breaks, looking for thermal tees, latex bras, queen casual pantsuits. My father, his yellow measuring tape hanging from his neck like a second tie, was the Schmer then, Mr. Irving Schmer. Now the Schmer in charge is my brother Stuart, and he stays afloat by outfitting the children of Blessed Sacrament, St. Hedwig's, Our Lady of Mount Carmel. I'm going to skip a little, read just a little more. He nearly kicked yesterday, he says, referring to our 90-year-old father. I stopped halfway up the second set of stairs to hear the story through. He told the physical therapist she had no business working if she's pregnant. Then he told an aide she had no business working when she has a cold. Then he called in the head dietitian to tell her the food stinks. After that, he fell asleep. Stuart puts a box under his arm like it's a football. He will always look like the athlete he formerly was. So he sleeps right through dinner, and Mom and I can't wake him, but he comes out of it at 10 and asks for a piece of fish. And they give him fish, a piece of scrod. What, he thinks he's on a Carnival cruise? What is this, the Love Boat? Only my father can score scrod at 10 at Harborview Nursing Home. This is because they're scared of him. You got to try, there's no harbor here, he says. You see a harbor here? There's no harbor. You got to travel 50 miles to get a harbor view, and that harbor smells like piss, just like here. Piss view, you could call it. When he is not insulting anyone, my father's mind is dull, but when he wants to trip you up, he's sharp as a tack. But the staff shot back. They sent him home today, and now he's our problem. Just a little bit, you get a sense of the bookends of the first and last story. And maybe when you'll hear from Kerri, you'll hear some more about Milltowns. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for listening.
Thank you, Sari. That was, it's family, you know, it's all about family.
It's all fiction.
Well, but it's portrayed really well. It sounds like real family to me. So I'd like to introduce Kerri next, and we'll do these readings back to back, and then we'll talk about where the connections are a little bit later. So Kerri is a book critic, a teacher. She's a book editor at Orion Magazine, nonfiction editor at the Franco-American journal Resonance, and the author of the best-selling book Milltown, Reckoning with What Remains, which won the Maine Literary Award for Nonfiction and the Rachel Carson Environmental Book Award from the Society of Environmental Journalists. Milltown was also a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Leonard Prize and is a 2021 Connecticut Book Awards finalist in the nonfiction category. Thank you. So welcome, Kerri.
Thanks, Lisa. Thanks for inviting me to this. And Sari, your reading was beautiful, and I can't believe there's so many images in there. Exhausted sweatshirts, for one. I just wrote that down. It was really beautiful. But here's something else. The passage I'm going to read, I haven't read before, and it's about retail, which is—
Oh, you're kidding.
I'm not kidding. It's about L.L. Bean, the most famous retail store in Maine. So it's about retail in Milltowns too. So we did not plan this, I know, but I think we'll have a lot to talk about after I read this. I too worked in retail for a long time. In fact, I've had 86 jobs, but we can talk about that later. So I'm going to start. I should tell anybody who hasn't read the book is about a paper mill town where I grew up in Western Maine. And it's a book of investigative memoir, cultural criticism, and a history really of the working class of New England and maybe of the United States, and an environmental history of the United States that parallels that. So just to set you up, I moved a lot. My husband was in the Coast Guard, and we just came back from Curacao, where we were living for 2 years. And I went immediately to L.L. Bean's to stock up on like winter things because we had been living anyway. So here I am. L.L. Bean sells nearly everything you need and many things you don't. 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. Clothes, guns, skis, bikes, tents, couches, fishing licenses, ukuleles, knot tying courses. You can even buy a holiday, like an 8-hour canoe tour down the Androscoggin River, complete with a lobster roll lunch. That's the Androscoggin is the river I grew up on, I should say. If you don't eat lobster, but enjoy the lobster aesthetic, Beans offers lobsterbelia, beach towels, hooked throw pillows, keychain fobs, lollipops, or a brass door knocker, all of it red, boiled, dead. I can't remember the first time I ate lobster, but while waitressing from age 15 to 30, I served it to thousands of tourists, many of whom weren't sure how to approach a red corpse resting on their plate. I'd crack open the shells for them, revealing the tender white meat and tamale, the soft green substance, considered a delicacy, and I'd slash my fingers in the process. The instruments of the meal always augured an annihilation, heavy metal crackers and forks to coerce the stubborn meat out of its casement, burying the flesh in a tub of hot butter. The plastic bib we wore featuring a red lobster as if to warn the critter before we boiled it, death is nigh. I always found something menacing about them. The way your teeth bounce on the meat, the way the claws open and close like pliers, their rubbery antenna, eyes protruding like 3D pimples, teeth in their stomachs, their clear blood, the way they molt, their captivity right up until the moment of their demise, the way they sound like they're screaming and boiled in water. My sister once dated a lobsterman, and he told me the traps were like an underwater food truck, waiting for lobsters to crawl in and have a snack. You sink the trap, weighed down with something like bricks, so it can race to the ocean floor. The lobsters enter the trap through a funnel-shaped net and drop into the kitchen to find herring or fish heads strung from a bait bag or string. Unable to pass back through the narrow conduit, they crawl up to another funnel-shaped net and drop into the parlor. And in the parlor, they become trapped again. That second egress, a sleight of hand that tricks the critter into thinking it's escaping. A backdoor exit allows the undersized juveniles to leave, but adults have no way out, like how I feel when I'm navigating LL Beans. So I'm going to skip ahead. In 1994, researchers discover unacceptably high levels of dioxin in Maine's lobster supply, predominantly in the tamale, with minuscule amounts in the meat. Maine drafted lobster consumption, sorry, I'm going to skip ahead. Dioxin, I can learn, can also be found in scant amounts in bleached paper products like tampons, coffee filters, tissues, baby food, diapers, and fertilizer on baseball fields, in gardens, in human placenta on farms, as fuel for our paper mill in contaminated sludge. Dioxin is a byproduct of the paper bleaching process that belongs to a class of chemicals called persistent organic pollutants, which resist the normal processes of degradation in the environment and in our bodies. Its half-life is 7 to 11 years. But we never stop accumulating it, so we take it to our graves. More than 90% of our exposure to dioxin is through our food supply, in the fatty part of living things like fish, clams, meat, and in the products like butter, eggs, cheese, lobster. Dioxin also accumulates in the breast milk of nursing mothers. Nursing infants are exposed to dioxin levels 77 times higher than the EPA recommends. And because dioxin is bioaccumulative, the further up the food chain it goes, the more concentrated and toxic it becomes. At the top of the food chain, the human body. Maine drafted lobster consumption limitations and recommended women and children not eat the tamale because it may contain harmful levels of dioxin. The message is not don't eat lobster, the DEP poorly clarified. Go and buy it, enjoy it, but just eat the meat. The State Marine Resources Commissioner concurred. It's not as serious a situation as it undoubtedly will want to be played by some. In 2009, the Maine Center for Disease Control and Prevention advises everyone, not just pregnant women and children, to refrain from eating lobster tamale because it can accumulate certain contaminants found in the environment, unquote, without naming dioxin as the source of those contaminants. The warning goes even further out of its way to be vague. There is no known safety considerations when it comes to eating lobster meat, it disclaims. I will ask Richard Clapp, an epidemiologist, why the government allows any acceptable amounts in our food stream for such a dangerous toxic. Quote, these decisions are based on politics, he says. They have nothing to do with health or biology. I'll stop there. I should say too, dioxin, I kind of skipped around a bit, but dioxin is one of the most toxic chemicals known to humankind. It was the same thing used in Agent Orange to defoliate the jungle. There. So it started out fun.
That's sobering. So, here we are.
I mean, make them laugh and make them cry.
Right? But it's a compelling story, and it's an important story and a compelling story that we should all regard with some alarm anyway. And we should know. And we'll touch about that a little bit later when we have a little Q&A a little bit later on, because I have some questions about that. So next we have Ben, last but not least. And I'm going to introduce you to him. His books include My Husband Would, which he'll be reading from tonight, a Forward Indies Book of the Year, and he is also the 2021 Connecticut Book Awards winner in the poetry category.
Woo.
Yay! Ben is also the author of Sweet Poor Orchard, winner of the Lambda Literary Award. He is a director of creative writing at the University of Hartford. So welcome, Ben.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you to Art de Julia and the Literary Festival. A pleasure to read with Kerri and Sari. I love both of your readings, so I'm really glad to be reading with y'all. I'm going to read a few poems from My Husband Would, and just like great fortuity, the first poem is about, at least in terms of setting, retail. So I'm glad to sort of be part of the club a little bit. This poem is called The Magic of Macy's, which used to be Macy's, I don't know if it is still, but it used to be sort of their tagline, The Magic of Macy's. A face like light, so much so that now I wonder if he was albino or had vitiligo, except that he had freckles and his hair, I remember, was pale red and his eyes pale blue, and tall, a good foot taller than I was, and with an unnoticing grace. I am 19, standing behind the coach counter at Macy's Herald Square. This feels like my first real job. I take a bus to the city. I wear a suit. I ask strangers if I can help them, even though I actually can't help them, since I know so little about leather goods. But I want to help. I am clean-shaven, virginal, terrified, thrilled, alternatively self-conscious, and dazzled into out-of-body experience. I float above coach to see before me the grandeur of Herald Square and myself, tie-knotted once by my father, then carefully removed each night by me to preserve the knot. Around me is Men's, around me is Macy's, around me is 34th and Manhattan, and I lean forward over the glass, breath held, waiting, because I have an inchoate sense that this is life, and that New Jersey, where I'm from, is not, is in fact the holding pen before life, where life, a bull with its balls tied too tight, somehow doesn't buck. Yet nothing happened that summer. I was initiated into nothing. I knew enough to understand there were other experiences, places nearby I could legally walk into where all manner of consumption was possible. There were hours after hours, spaces to spend the night that didn't involve taking the bus back to New Jersey. Let's be clear. We're talking men, multiple men, and drugs. Nighttime as a method of operation with a range of textures that still, 20 years later, I have admired only behind glass. The price tag, the softness of the leather, the grain, we called it, as if it were a kind of wood, the once living skin that, cared for, lasts decades. Truth is, I waited behind that counter for life to walk up and extend its long finger, the three-jointed bones of a skeletal hand or something simian, the dark knuckly digit of an ape, tap down hard on the glass, then turn swiftly, drawing me Pied Piper-like after. My supervisor, a jowly 50-year-old with a lisp and a gap in his front teeth, did ask me to dinner, and I refused with a silent, emphatic shake of the head. But aside from that, summer wore on, showing me nothing. Except once. The day he walked in, my nearly elven redhead. But he is not elven. Though impossibly tall and graceful, his chest is wide, defined. He doesn't look at me, just down at the glass, his long red eyelashes combing over his eyes, just barely blue, like watercolor, diluted to the point where it runs down the page. A man is with him, also impossibly tall, also with a wide chest, small waist, though darker. And as the redhead looks through the glass I stand before, the second man leans softly against him and smiles. Do I desire them? At first glance, you might assume we are different species. Fleshy, awkward thing that I am, my bloated tie knot and bar mitzvah suit, awkward trundling thing smearing the counter glass with his palms, and them like palm trees, cool, tropical, a sure sign you are somewhere you can't long afford to stay. I do speak to them. I ask if they want to see something. I ask, are they shopping for an occasion? Then I try to think of something else, but the red-haired one shakes his head slightly and turns away without making eye contact. His companion follows, and they scroll off together, in love, as I imagine. Together from some country where men are all built on that scale, where skin is that clear, and lashes always auburn. A mountaintop place where humans grow longer and more graceful in the thinner air. It seems they have come down to meet me over the glass barrier between us, to show me something of life, since I have in fact bussed all the way up from Marlborough and walked over 8 blocks among a crowd from Port Authority. You can get this. Close, they seem to say, the redhead's eyes sweeping down as he looks past me to the glass. You can get just this close. The next poem I'm going to read is called A Thought, and it's about realizing after the fact that I thought differently about something very important. And I don't know if it's explicitly spelled out in the poem, but in the context of the book, that thing is marriage. So maybe it's in the poem, maybe not, but a thought. Like a feather descending in its back and forth motion, slow twirl to one end of a balance, and that end begins to sink. But so slowly, days pass, an unscrolling of weather, the view out the same window over a series of months. Trees burst in lime green flowers so tiny that 3 or 4 buds could rest on the tip of your thumb. And then come rainy days, darker leaves and brightness expanding like the yawning of one just woken, everything unfolding, changing, and now you find it is autumn, and somewhere inside is a difference, a quiet monumental thing, difference, some dream that had long seemed foundation wall to a structure you'd hoped to build, a Jeffersonian grandness. You'd imagined marble, imagined columns, but now it is you who seem to find the structure more trouble than it's worth. You who just might, you decide, Be okay without so much grandiosity. You even surprised yourself with that word, grandiosity, with its undertone of mocking. What was it? A word, a look from a man that wasn't, you realized a moment too late, directed at you? A casual lapse that added its name like another entry on a long petition. No one, not even you, heard the creaking sweep, the rusted iron gate of your will. Though afterward, at the window, you may have wondered what kind of bird dropped that feather, though so long ago now, there's no telling what kind, or on its way to what country. And I'm just going to read one last poem, which is sort of the coda of the book. And it's called I Marry. I marry. I marry a column of air. I marry my own freedom, and at the altar, it and I merely brush knuckles. I marry time and march to the dais, one forward step as each second ticks. I marry sex and refuse to care who steps into its body, as man after man does. I marry a cat or an impulse like one, reclining alone in darkness, waking to its warm breathing. I marry hot liquid in winter, curving around the mug of it, and in summer, the cold grip of a plastic bottle tipped over my lips. I marry the silk pucker of a coffin lining, then file for divorce and give myself wholly to well-fitting cotton underwear and socks, and am for once convincingly held. This man gets down on one knee and raises a small velvet box into a wind that lifts it from his fingers, funneling it up to the leaden sky.
Thank you. That was beautiful.
Indeed. Oh, well, you've had such an interesting array this evening, and I have questions, and I'm sure other people do. I'm seeing some of the questions start to come up. But what I did want to ask before we go to those questions, my questions, because I get to ask them first because I'm here, right? So I get to ask, right? So Sarah, we talked about this a little bit earlier. You kind of grew up in a factory town. You already kind of commented on that, and so did Kerri. So I guess I'm not sure how to frame this question because you guys anticipated me, I guess, a little bit. But those stories that are there, Sari, these are stories from, well, your recollections in a way from growing up a little bit. And I guess the question I was going to ask is, can you both talk a little bit about people's livelihoods and how they were lost really when these factory towns kind of are no longer functioning as factory towns any longer, and really, the lifeblood of these towns are through their industry or through the manufacture of those towns, and they're just not there anymore. And so what did that mean for those places and for you?
Growing up, so many students, I went to school with friends, they were all children of rubber workers. My father's a rubber worker, my mother's a rubber worker. And then it was US Rubber, became Uniroyal. They went south, literally, they went south. And so how does that affect a retail? How does that affect the life of a store when your customer base, totally goes away? And for my brother, who inherited the store, he launched onto the idea of jeans. Jeans were kind of the first savior of the store. We transitioned from kind of worker clothes to to jeans of the 60s. And then everyone was selling jeans, you know, Kmart and JCPenney and the little, you know, what was a little guy, you know, this little mom and pop store. Then he did in fact transition to Catholic school uniforms. So here's a Jewish merchant, you know, selling the Catholic school uniforms, and he just, you know, really was able to change with the times. And you know, LL Bean is just timeless. I mean, they're just totally timeless. Well, although maybe their end is near with the demise of the lobster. I don't.
Yes, the lobster.
I love that lobster talk. Oh, you sold me with the lobster.
Yeah, or maybe not sold you.
Oh,
Maybe
well,
you don't never want to eat a lobster again. I don't know.
I won't eat it again. But did you grew up in a mill town?
Yeah, me? Yeah, me or Lisa? Are you talking?
not me.
You, Kerri, did you grow up in a mill town?
Yeah, so my mill town is a current mill town still. The mill it's a paper mill town in Western Maine, and it's where 3 generations of my family worked, both sides of my family in that mill since 1901 when it opened. And the mill is still open, but it's been devastated by 40, 50 years of policy that favors industry over humans. Well, maybe 100 years of policy. So much so that, you know, when I was growing up, I had a really happy childhood. It was great, but we didn't know we were being poisoned, for one thing. Second, you know, these policies, I say specifically over the last 40 years, have really sort of hollowed out that town. I mean, there's people still working. Maybe it's a quarter of what the labor force was at the mill. But now, you know, it has devastating poverty there. 4 to 5 kids there are food insecure. So like every kid in the school district gets free lunch, every kid. And now they're starting to feed families. There's a nonprofit that bought a food truck and they're bringing food around to families. It was the highest crime rate in the nation, in the state, when I was working on the book. And just today I saw in the news that Maine has one of the highest rates of lung cancer in the country. No surprise to me, but everybody seems surprised. I mean, that's in the middle of writing the book. My father died of cancer from environmental toxics. So yeah, so what has happened to these towns is they've been hollowed out, but people can't leave. They really can't sell their house, and there's no place to go. And but combined with that too is, you know, in mill towns, just like lobstermen or a store owner or whatever, their jobs are really tied to their identity. So what's even worse is a lot of people are losing their identity, I think, is what's really tragic. And where to go from there is, I don't know. I don't know the answers. My book asks more questions than gives answers, but yeah, that's what's going on in that town. And the good news is there is a lawsuit against one paper mill in Maine that is recently over the summer has sued. The paper used to spread this dioxin-laced sludge over farms and baseball fields, like I said, in the reading. So they found one specific farm and one specific mill, but it's really all over the state. So I hope sort of they start looking a little closer. And
So it's
and Connecticut, I'm sure it's Connecticut, Massachusetts, it's New England industry. So.
Yeah, all those manufacturing towns in New England. Now, Ben, I don't want to leave you out. I don't want to leave you out of this conversation. But I was wondering that much of what you've written, I reread parts of your book today, so I'd be prepared. I was wondering, when you wrote this, it covers a lot of time. I guess that's where I'm going with that. It covers a great deal of time. Did you start your writing of these earlier, or is this collection? When did you begin writing this collection? I guess is the question I'm trying to articulate.
I wrote the book between 2014 and 2018.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, I was trying to sort of get a historical sense. The book really crystallized when gay marriage was legalized in 2015, and I began to write about, there's a lot of poems in the book about, marriages in my family, and just, sort of putting the question of marriage in a bigger context, thinking about how it might be a possibility for me or not, sort of wrestling with that real idea. It's hard to believe, because I don't think of myself as that old, but I'm old enough to remember in 2000, when I was 17, 18, 19, I remember I was at a conference and there was a lawyer speaking. It was like some high school or college thing about gay marriage. And the lawyer said, within the next 20 years, this is a possibility. And I remember, me and the people there being like, yeah, right. That and, transporter beams and warp speed and all that. It just seemed like ridiculous. So I'm old enough to remember when that was, right up there with Little Men Dancing on the Moon. So when it was legalized, it was something for me to write about. Now it just seems so normal, so uneventful. But if you're old enough, it's still a little shocking.
So it's a great amazement, and that it's a wonderful amazement, and it is
a wonderful amazement.
Yeah, it is a wonderful amazement. So
there's lots of when Kerri was just talking about Maine, I was experiencing the other kind of amazement, and one is used to that kind. So the wonderful kinds.
Yeah, it's wonderful. Sadly, the manufacturing towns, I often wonder, the Maine, this is a story that's across New England, as you say, but I often wonder about places like Naugatuck and places like Waterbury and places where those toxics are in the, they must be there.
Or the Niger Delta or the Amazon forest.
Right.
It's the same thing happening. There's enough toxics in all of us. It's funny. I was going to go back to what Ben was saying. Right. I was sort of writing about the past too in this book, in the first half of the book, and it seemed like it's interesting you say that maybe it seems like it's kind of common, but at the same time it doesn't, and it doesn't feel it. We're still, I think society is still struggling with these things, just like they're still struggling with accepting the idea that the toxics there's so much in our environment that it's in all our blood up here. It's just, I don't know, I felt some kind of similarity to what you're saying. It's like you think, and I think that this is a known thing, it's an understood thing, but it's really not at a lot of levels, and I think that writing our stories and having our stories read by many people shows that maybe everybody doesn't know what we're exactly talking about, or at least the nuance of it,
It's amazing when you say things like one of the things about humans that sort of fascinating to me is how quickly we become inured to anything.
Yeah, right.
To COVID, yeah, the new normal. Ben, your poems. Well, of course, I love it. I love that the first one, especially, is such a narrative poem, and being a fiction writer, I love following the story. But your images are just so exquisite, and I think I will always remember the glass counter you talk about, over which the narrator is meeting, the two men.
Yeah.
And I love the glass. In my father's store, there was a glass counter, the jewelry counter, but there's something so magical about a glass counter, like anything can happen under the glass counter. I just think that's so compelling, and I love you talked about the tie and preserving the knot, and that really stuck with me. Preserving the knot, which ties in also with the marriage thing, it's just so rich. It's so rich.
Is it not fascinating that we all read about retail in some way? That's kind of, I don't know what to think of that. Maybe we should start a little mini tour about, they're all so different, but they're all pointing to some kind of consumerist or I don't know what it's, I don't know. I have to think about it, but there's something really interesting.
Well, okay, I don't want to get too carried away, but I will. Okay.
Go ahead.
So, okay, so the glass counter, you know, there's things beneath the glass counter in the same way. I'm thinking of your lobster, the way they trap the lobsters, and there's all these levels of entrapment, including the parlor, which is where people used to, like, in high society, meet in their finery.
Thank you for, yes, exactly. And they're getting trapped.
Yeah, you know, all these levels of entrapment. Well, first you go here and then you enter the parlor. And
I couldn't believe what a metaphor it was. I mean, it was kind of a metaphor for our town too. Like I was saying, you know, it's people, some people were like, why don't they leave? I'm like, well, they can't leave. I mean, who are they going to sell their house to? I mean, they're like lobsters, you know, and lobster being, you know, a very big symbol too of Maine. Like that countertop is a very big symbol of retail or encounters too. I see the counter as like an encounter, you know.
Ha. And then you had the encounter over the counter. Okay, I will stop because I'm getting a little.
I love it. No, this is fun.
Punchy. It's my bedtime.
Well, we've got a couple of questions that are lurking in here. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to bring them up.
I kind of didn't see them.
I get them here. They're both for Ben. Let's ask Ben.
No, let's see. I don't. Oh gosh.
They're for you, Ben.
Here, I'll read it out loud so you can
No,
can answer it. So Ben, how do you decide what specific details to put in each poem versus what gets translated through the context of the book?
You know, I have a thought about this, and it's a cool question to pass on to Kerri and Sherry when I'm done. So, you know, the poet T.S. Eliot talks about bad poets being conscious where they should be unconscious, and unconscious where they should be conscious. Which is to say that, you know, when you write poetry, it's really a leap of faith. You have to trust that some part of you is aware of what the details can do and reaches for them without you sort of knowing. Like, right, like a glass counter that eventually becomes a kind of glass ceiling, except not, let's say, for women's advancement, but for seeing into a life that you can never penetrate. But you can't know that when you begin the poem. And if you began the poem knowing the detail was going to function sort of emblematically, it would come out so contrived. So you feel the authorial shaping in a way that's like, dude, get off your poem. Like, let the poem be.
Get off your poem.
So the right details, it's really a kind of fortuity that you have to hope subconsciously, you know, that you're choosing things that somewhere, you know, have this resonance, and that it will get leaked to you bit by bit in the process of composition. In fiction, in creative nonfiction, does it work that way? Is there that sort of, like, your mind feeds you details and only later you're like, oh yes.
Totally.
Yeah, you've got a business about kind of stepping out of the way and trusting your brain to, you know, generate images, which then, to me, the images are all clues, you know, and your kind of image, and what does that mean, you know, and not a heavy-handed way, but I'm always looking for clues in my own work, you know, and they're all in these small details.
Like
I think
leaving breadcrumbs.
Yeah, I love that. Leaving breadcrumbs, you said.
Yeah, and you're supposed to find them.
Right. Yeah.
I love that about clues. That's like I was saying, I was interrogating like the myths of Maine, and lobster is a big one. And so I just started writing about it, everything I knew about lobsters, which was basically feeding them to people. And that's how it started. So like you said, I just sort of got out of the way of it and just started writing about it. And then I started wondering, how do they trap them? I knew it was a weird thing. And I looked it up, I watched a video, I talked to my husband, like, and realized that, oh my God, this is, you know, it just, you're right, it just happens. And then if you just follow all the bits, and then you even pointed out something that I hadn't realized about the sort of parlor aspect and the kitchen aspect where nice things are supposed to happen, not
Right.
trapping. And I never even thought of that. Like it just,
Right.
yeah, really. So I love that, following the breadcrumbs.
Yeah. I really think that there's a huge, it's a huge act of faith to try to create anything. You know, I mean, have you guys ever had I have this situation all the time, but it's easier with poems because they're short. Like, you know, you started something, you get 2/3 of the way through and you're like, yeah, no, this isn't going to happen.
It took me 10 years to write my book. So
Okay.
happened every day. What am I doing? And the last thing I wanted to write about was this, you know.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I mean,
Is there a sort of sense of exhaustion if you're doing something for 10 years? I mean, especially, you know, a sense of sort of like, oh, is that going to be over? I mean, I don't know. It's
yeah, I was exhausted the whole time, but at the same time propelled by the people of the town. And, you know, I got to see my parents more and visit them more. So that was good. But it was like opening a Pandora's box. The more I researched, the more I found, and the bigger the project became. And that was the exhausting part. Like I even write about the research in the book itself and how huge and large it was. That sorry, my cat's asking to go out.
You know, I just want to
each other. I don't know. So, yours and Ben's.
we have a few more minutes. I just want to say I worked on a novel for over 10 years, and I asked myself that question, you know, am I tired of this? And I have to say that I really, I love language. So I will mudgy with a sentence forever until it's right and get, you know, pleasure and frustration out of that. But somehow in the reworking and the revising sentence by sentence, it's really a sentence by sentence thing. And you have to love sentences. You know, that's really all I can say. It's, you know,
Yeah.
Line by line. It's line
Well,
by line.
I feel like we all do. I think Ben does too. I can tell,
Ben,
obviously.
yeah.
As a poet, you have to, but
have to. And
I'm the
when
same. Yeah.
when I was listening to Sari read, and then I was listening to Ben read, it was just that resonance of poetry for me in both, in even though they're completely different styles, but you can hear it as you're listening along.
Yeah.
Those turns of phrase in both, and you know, it's a different experience when you're listening, obviously, than when you're reading it. I think
Right.
Regarding music of language, you know, I was thinking about your ear, Sari, like schmur is such a funny sound, and it gets funnier. Like it's clear that the music, the sound of language is very significant in your process.
Yeah.
You know, let's see, somebody became like the lead schmur or something, like the head schmur is so funny.
It's good.
Yeah. You know, initially I had the store's name was Schmear because it was this, that, the whole schmear. And I thought, that's too much.
That's over the top.
That's over the top. So a friend of mine who knows German, she said, Schmer. And Schmer has worked, and Schmer's in the novel, if the novel ever sees the light of day. But
There's one more question here for Ben.
Yeah, there is one more question, and it's for you again, Ben. Do you want me to read it to you? You want to read it to yourself and answer it? I don't know. The comment is wonderful reading, all. Ben, different poems seem to be aimed at different readers. A close confidant in one, nearly a history student in another. While composing, do you sense different audiences, different ears?
these are great questions.
That is a great question. So that's an interesting thing. I think maybe that we all wrestle with in different ways. You know, who do you write for? Who do you write for in different texts or in different? Who do you imagine as your ideal listener? You know, in answer to David's question, I some poems I really do have. I mean, even a specific person in mind. who for whatever reason has fired me to say something to them that that real life has no space for. You know, there's no way to, you know, whatever, the reality can't hold that conversation. It just isn't, it's too quick, it's too loud, it's too bright. So yeah, I think very specifically sometimes about, I mean, not like I don't plan it, but you know, in my head, like I'm reacting to something. There's somebody I want to explain something to, and sometimes it's just myself. You know, how about you guys? Do you think about ideal readers or particular readers for certain passages or whole books or texts?
I feel very similar when I write. My book has so many different voices in it. They're all me, but me as character, me as author, me as like a 10-year-old. There's all different voices of me talking to different people. I think the overall audience I wanted to reach was the people that I was writing about, mainly. But with an ear towards other people too. I always had my mentor in my head. Like I had friends that were readers were saying, that's too much technical information. Don't put that, you know, there were different, you know, like little devil angels on your shoulders too, but they're gently helping you, steering you towards this audience that, you know, but always with the audience in mind of the people that I was writing about, because it was important to not to tell their story, but to like say, this is a story that hasn't been told, and I want them to hear it and see themselves in it.
Well, like it's the honesty in all of your writing. It's gentle honesty, maybe. Maybe not sometimes, and sometimes it doesn't have to be gentle. Sometimes you have to be cruel to be kind, as they say. And so, you know, it's sometimes that's what has to come across, but that's okay. You know, as I'm reading all of them, I kind of got that feeling. So
I find that really moving, Kerri. The idea that I don't know if it's exactly validating, but something to have people hear their story told to them. I mean, it just seems like a really loving gesture.
That's lovely. Yeah.
I mean, thank you. It just seemed like the right, I mean, the deeper I got into the story, it was, in fact, it became so, you know, it's investigative, but at the same time, every single person that I wrote about, I knew. And growing up, I knew for years, or I knew most of them. So it was also a really sort of intense subjective thing. It wasn't just objective. And then to the point where like there's a paper mill worker, he graduated a couple of years ahead of me. He signs my books because he feels such a part of it.
Yeah.
Which is to me the most thrilling thing. Like he signs it in our town. I haven't been to the town since I wrote the book because of the pandemic, but anyway.
So we are a little bit past 8. So I just wanted to come in and start wrapping things up. I wanted to thank you all so much for being here tonight. Everyone who attended, do not forget to purchase a copy of all of these amazing books. We have Milltown, My Husband Would, and Father Guards the Sheep. We have purchase links right in the chat, so you can easily click on those to purchase all your books, or again, you can visit us in store. Thank you to Ben, Sari, and Kerri, and Lisa for joining us tonight. It has been such a wonderful event with you all, and we really appreciate you guys being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Victoria.
Thank
Thank
you.
you, Lisa.
Let's take this show on the road.
I hope everyone has a great rest of their night. Thank you so much for joining us.
thanks. Bye-bye.
Great meeting you all. What a pleasure.